I am Ruth Burcaw, director of the board of Cooperative Ministries, and today we're going to talk about what the heck is ecumenism, and see if I can even pronounce it correctly over the course of the event. But I'm actually going to let Brother Wrights, Bishop Graham Wrights, kick us off because he's actually got some I think helpful information to share to kind of give us some context as we start talking about being ecumenical. So I'll take it away, Brother Wrights.
Okay, I'm going to begin with a question. Who are we as Moravians? Who are we as Moravians? We are the heirs of the old Unitist Fratrum of Bohemia and Moravia, which began in 1457 in the village of Coonwald. Later, this group turned to the Waldensian Church as a source for its ordained ministry. Still later, it sought relationships with the Utriquist Church of its own lands, and also after the 16th century Reformation, with Reformed and Lutheran bodies, often expressing this relationship in formal statements. In his book, The Theology of the Czech Brethren from Huss to Comenius, Brother Craig Atwood remarks that it is illuminating that the unity was instrumental in bringing about reconciliation among Protestant churches in both Bohemia and Poland in the 16th century. He speaks of, quote, the unity's persistent efforts to reunite the body of Christ, unquote. But points out that, quote, the brethren refused to give up their distinctive organization and voice in the world, even as they worked for cooperation among churches with different confessions of faith, unquote. So from our earliest days, we've been reaching out in relationship to Christian brothers and sisters of other church bodies. Who are we as Moravians? We're those who recognize the important contribution of Bishop John Amos Comenius. Craig Atwood notes that, quote, Comenius' vision of an ecumenical council of interdependent communities of faith developed out of this fundamental commitment of the unity of the brethren to work for cooperation among churches with different confessions of faith. For Comenius, quote, reunification of the church was part of the work of Christ, who cannot be divided and must be a part of the mission of the community of faith, unquote. Comenius wrote in his Panegyricia, you are Christians, sworn to unite and not to separate. Following the suppression of unity in its native lands, Comenius republished Unity's Ratio Disciplinae, prefacing his edition with a dedication to the Church of England and committing the care of the unity to that body. Who are we as Moravians? We're the spiritual descendants of those from Bohemia and Moravia who immigrated to Saxony, and there with others who joined them began the renewed Moravian Church in the village of Hermann on the estate of Count Nicholas Ludwig von Zinzendorf. It should come as no surprise that the renewed Moravian Church developed with a strong sense of ecumenicity. Its patron and early leader, Count Zinzendorf, was, in the words of the author A.J. Lewis, the ecumenical pioneer. Wherever the Moravian Church spread, it sought fraternal relationships with other Christian bodies, and this spirit has continued to be an important feature of our church. Who are we as Moravians? We're those who look to our fundamental statement, the ground of the unity, for a description of who we are. Among the declarations of this document, we find the following. It is the Lord's will that Christendom should give evidence of and seek unity in him with zeal and love. In our own midst, we see how such unity has been promised us and laid upon us as a charge We welcome every step that brings us nearer the goal of unity in Him. That's who we are as Moravians. Now, I've been asked to say a word also about the establishment of full communion of the Moravian Church with the Episcopal Church. When the northern and southern provinces of the Moravian Church began to explore full communion with other denominations in line with who we are as Moravians, they began with the Evangelical Lutheran Church. And after talks, we decided on full communion, and it was passed by our Synod of 1998. This was an appropriate group to begin with, since the Moravian Church was being renewed in Hermann, and those there involved worship at the nearby Lutheran Church in Bertelsdorf. And Count Zinzendorf was a Lutheran, and so the Lutheran Church highly influenced these early renewed Moravians. The Episcopal Church, because we had also in our early days had close ties with the Church of England, and the Episcopal Church is part of the worldwide Anglican Union along with the Church of England. Zinzendorf even at one time had suggested that Moravians have a bishop from the Church of England participate in our consecration of bishops. This was not realized, however, because his good friend, the Archbishop of Canterbury, died before he could make the proposal. The Episcopal Church had previously established full communion with the Evangelical Lutheran Church, with which we were also in relationship, and so saw that doing the same with the Episcopal Church would complete a triangle. Prior to our dialogue with the Episcopalians, the British province of the Moravian Church had talks with the Church of England that resulted in the Fetter Lane Common Statement. This details agreements achieved during substantial agreements in theology and committal of the two to share a common life and mission. The Moravian Episcopal Dialogue decided early on to begin with the achievements of the earlier dialogue in England and work together toward recognition that would also include interchange of clergy. The Episcopalians in the dialogue knew just how to achieve this in their communion. They cited the Chicago Lambeth Quadrilateral, which they described as the blueprint by which the Episcopal Church enters into full communion proposals with other churches. They pointed out that one element in this quadrilaterals deems necessary for any dialogue involving the Episcopal Church that the other church, crucial for them is the historic episcopate locally adapted in the methods of its administration to the varying needs of the nations and peoples called into the unity of the church. On the basis of the early Unitas Fratrum's intention of having their first bishop consecrated by another bishop in the line of succession to the early church, and of the renewed church to go back to the someone who was a bishop in the earlier Unitas Fratrum to be the consecrating bishop for the renewed church bishop. They felt these intentions would show that we met the locally adapted clause. In 2009, the General Convention of the Episcopal Church approved unanimously the full communion agreement with the Moravians. The following year, both Northern and Southern Province synods approved the agreement. In February of 2011, a service in celebration of full communion was held in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, which included a ceremony of mutual recognition and reconciliation of ordained ministries, represented by the mutual recognition and blessing of each other's episcopal ministries. As Moravian bishops laid hands upon and prayed over episcopal bishops, and Episcopal bishops did the same with Moravian bishops. Since this agreement, Episcopal bishops have participated in our consecrations of bishops, and in the area where Moravian churches are located, Moravian bishops have participated in consecrations of Episcopal bishops. Two of our ministers, Carl Sutherland and Jim Doss, have entered service with Episcopal congregations. So our establishment and carrying on of a relationship with other denominations.
Thank you, Graham. I'm aware that you have to go because you have a funeral to attend. I didn't know if anybody had any specific questions about that and about the statement. That was the statement you read early was from the 2010 Synod, correct? Is that right?
A statement I made at the 2010 Synod when we were considering the coming together.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Well, thank you for the background on that and on the Episcopalian covenant agreement. That's awesome. And we'll let you just duck out whenever you are, need to do that.
Thank you.
And I want to know, I don't know if Rock knows, Betsy Miller is the president of our Northern Province Provincial Elders Conference, and David Guthrie is the president of our Southern Province, our Provincial Elders Conference. So both of them obviously do some ecumenical work on our behalf. And then we've got Bishop Wayne Burcaw here as well, who you worked with. You work with the Methodist group. Is that the group you worked with, Wayne, specifically?
No, I was a part of the original Moravian Lutheran dialogue way back 100 years ago, whenever it seems like a long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
And then was
last century.
Yeah, it was the last century, actually. And then was PEC president when we were looking at the proposal for full communion with the Episcopal Church. Helped with the preparation for that for Synod. That Graham alluded to.
And we might acknowledge there have been two others with Methodist and Presbyterian churches.
Well, I didn't know if David and Betsy wanted to speak to whatever it is they wanted to speak to as it relates to ecumenism. Take it away.
David, do you want to keep going with the Southern Province perspective here?
Sure. Well, I think Graham's kind of helped us with sort of the foundational aspects of things. I think another guideline that we follow, and I'll speak to some of it, is back in 2002, there was a report from our Ecumenical Affairs Commission to our Synod, which when we say Synod, it's our church-wide assembly or gathering. I don't know what they call that in the UCC, but it's basically is the meaning of full communion for Moravians, and so we have attended to attach this to full communion agreements that we've made with these other denominations. But what I think is important is we sort of spell it out, and it's very similar to what other denominations say. I mean, in other words, you have to have an understanding of full communion before you enter into an ecumenical relationship. So we respect each other as part of the one holy Catholic Apostolic Church. We mutually recognize the practice of the sacraments, and that allows for exchangeability. We recognize the validity of ministerial orders, and we have an orderly exchange of pastors subject to the guidelines of each denomination. We acknowledge that we're going to be different. It doesn't mean we're going to be moving toward merger or unity or agreement and everything, but we try to learn from each other in our differences. we recognize that every church brings gifts, and that's part of our heritage. That we look to. We're one among many, and everybody has their gifts, and we need to share and learn from each other. That's important. And then the final one is we cooperate in common Christian mission through what we do: faith, life, and witness. And I think for me, the two areas that are sort of probably the most visible, and well, maybe not the most visible, but certainly the most significant parts of these arrangements that we have, this ecumenical life that we live, is shared worship has always been something very important to Moravians, and appreciating the different traditions in worship. And the second thing is the final point of this long list, which is cooperation and common witness and service. And I was a pastor for 17 years. I've been in administration for about the same length of time. And I do know back in the day when I was serving in Florida, it was the common witness in service piece that was such a valuable and enriching part of ecumenism. It was right down at the grassroots. It was members meeting members, members joining with members, serving, making a difference in the community, being a visible witness of unity by, wearing our different T-shirts but still on the same habitat build, that kind of stuff. And so, to me, ecumenism can be way up here, but that final point really brings it home, which is it's about common witness and common service, working together to make a difference in the world for the sake of the kingdom. And so I get really excited when that kind of stuff happens. So that's kind of my little talk, at least at this point. So.
So from the Northern Province perspective, I apologize for being a little bit late. I was on an ecumenical panel, the National Council of Churches Christian Unity Gathering. We were talking about reparation, something that Moravians have a long way to go to even start talking about it. I think I was the token white woman on the panel. But I would actually like to defer and ask our ecumenical officer, who's been a volunteer ecumenical officer for longer than I've been in ministry, perhaps. I don't know, Reverend Dr. Hermann Weinlick. I don't know if you've already introduced yourself, or Ruth, you've introduced him, but I'd like to let him take a go at, and then maybe I'll fill in some blanks.
Okay, can I? Let's see.
We can hear you, Herman. You were on already. Go back to what you had. Yep, still in mute.
Muted.
Well, I can't read his lips.
Herman, we can't hear you.
Herman, we can't hear you. There you go.
In Minnesota, we have 7 congregations. 4 have some ecumenical congregation. 1 is served by a Moravian who has just come from serving a Methodist church. 1 is served by a Methodist who is serving a Methodist church in the same community, felt the need to change. 1 is served by a Presbyterian who is also serving a Lutheran ELCA congregation. And 1 is served by I guess I covered them all. But just a couple things I would comment. That 2 things that Moravians, or a number of things I've experienced in talking with others. 1 is we have less concern than many other denominations about someone from another denomination serving in a Moravian church. There are far fewer hurdles to jump or hoops to go through for somebody from another denomination to serve a Moravian church. 2, something we don't think much about, but we kind of assume that a pastor will be a member of the church she or he is serving. In many denominations, that would be quite foreign and might even be opposed for theological theological reasons. Thirdly, in ecumenical associations, an important piece of discussion is advocacy as well as charity, and that, at least traditionally, has not been part of our Moravian DNA. Another thing I would just comment, a couple of final comments that are more mixed. All of the people we have full communion relationships with are members of the National Council of Churches. And in the Southern Province Synod, which discussed the entering full communion with the Episcopal Church, one of the more conservative pastors, who has since left the Southern Province, had sort of a nuisance resolution, which I think had a grain of truth in it. He proposed that we start ecumenical conversations with the Southern Baptists and the Greek Orthodox Church. And that is probably not realistic, but I think we do have to recognize that those that we do have full communion with is just one slice of the Christian church around the world. One final thought, the modern or the 20th century ecumenical movement really was an outgrowth or a result of the missionary thrust that the Moravians were part of the beginning in the 1800s, 1700s, and which really burst around the world in the 1800s. And the World Council of Churches is really a result of conversations at the International Missionary Conference. And that really, we have mixed feelings about that today, because many people view the whole mission emphasis, which is where the Moravian Church has been most visibly in its whole history. There are many Christian leaders that now see that as simply one of the sins of colonialism. So that's a kind of a mixed thing, which is part of our conversations, our ecumenical conversations. I will stop there.
Thank you, Herman. And I just want to fill in some gaps and just some factoids, as it were, if that's okay, Ruth? Okay, so Rock, for your benefit maybe and others, down the Northern Province has congregations in 12 states, the District of Columbia, and 2 Canadian provinces. So that means that we have both relationships as a province, with such like the National Council of Churches, and we share relationships with the World Council of Churches, and the South represents us at that. We're part of the Christian Churches United in Christ. The South represents us both of us on the Christian churches together. We both try to find somebody to get us to the Churches for Middle East Peace, and right now that's Rick. No, it's Rick Sides, right, David? I'm looking. Yeah, thank you. And Church World Service, which is an advocacy group, and Chris Giesler from the Border World Mission represents us on that. But then we're also part of some state councils of churches, and our district presidents either represent us on those, or some pastors join in that area. And that's in Pennsylvania, New York, Ohio, Maryland, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. And then, as if that weren't enough, the province through the Canadian district has observer status with the Canadian Council of Churches, the equivalent of the National Council. And the Canadian district is now exploring a trilateral relationship with the Anglican Church of Canada and the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada. And so they want to call it LAM in honor of our heritage, LAM. It's a little bit of a play on words, but I don't know how far that's going to go. I think Herman has really, and David have stressed sort of the emphasis behind why we're ecumenical, I think. And to be honest, there's some also very practical things. We Moravians benefit a lot from the bigger denominations by way of resources. When we're trying to figure out how to do something, I will reach out to my Episcopal and Lutheran ecumenical officers and counterparts at the national level and just say, hey, can you give us some people? We need help in this area. What can you do? And they're always more than gracious. I always sort of feel like we are on the receiving end far more than we're on the giving end of that. And I think that it's really just a matter of how we walk together in faith. We could do all the sort of the nitty gritty stuff of orderly exchange and all of those, but that doesn't really matter nearly as much as the witness and the common walk and the advocacy that we benefit from because of some of what they have taught us. So we are also locally part of some interfaith groups. Christy Melby Gibbons in Milwaukee is part of the Interfaith Conference of Greater Milwaukee. And there is a thing called BIG in Bethlehem Interfaith Group. So that is an outgrowth of particularly some of the anti-Muslim, anti-Jewish hate crimes that have occurred that we've now got some of our pastors that are part of join with the Muslim, Sikh, and Jewish colleagues in the area. So it's all just part of how we try to, I don't know, live locally and globally. So that's my shtick, Ruth.
I do think it's important to point out that, at least from the Moravian Church's perspective, the organizations that ecumenical organizations that we're involved with are not all at the organizational, institutional level. They're Christian churches together, which David is currently involved in, and may not be as active as it was when I was PEC president. I'm not sure, David, what the status of Christian churches together is, but that's really an organization that does include denominations and Christian traditions that are not members of the National Council or World Council or maybe any other council of churches, as far as I know. But that is formed not so much on an organizational or institutional basis as on a cooperative service and witness basis. So Christian churches together is a little different approach to ecumenism from the conciliar or full communion kind of ecumenical relationship.
Yeah, Wayne, we just had our annual forum last week, and CCT continues its focus. And you're right, the five church families that are represented there, you're not going to get those people in the same room at the same time anywhere else. So it's always kind of, I find it a lot of fun. I'll never forget one of my first meetings, the evangelical Pentecostal family of CCT. There's Roman Catholic, Orthodox, evangelical Pentecostal, historic Protestant, historic Black, and we're all in the same room. So the Pentecostal group, evangelical Pentecostal, was leading morning prayer, which included some music and some movement that was just, it was one of these, let's all raise our hands, and we were getting involved in the worship. And I turn around and see two Catholic archbishops raising their hands and moving to the music, and I thought, yeah, you're not going to see this everywhere in the ecumenical world, but it's I can tell lots of stories like that, but I think that's
It's coming soon.
yeah, exactly. But to me, I think Moravians being so experiential about our faith, it's stuff like that and swinging a hammer together and making a difference in somebody's life, concrete stuff that just really speaks to us. I think especially with the younger generation, so to speak, the millennials, you start talking about ecumenism, their eyes are gonna glaze over. But if you talk about stuff like I just shared, or the Common Habitat Project, or whatever, or standing together across the boundaries for an important social issue, you start talking about those things, and man, their eyes light up. So I think the practical aspect of this ecumenical involvement is really, really where it is these days.
And David, that a thought we had when I was serving with the PEC. We were trying to identify younger lay or clergy leadership for ecumenical work in the future. And that was, I'll have to admit, it was kind of a frustrating thing. We looked around the ecumenical room and realized that all of us involved in ecumenism in one way or another were getting on up in years. And so we were asking ourselves, where's the next generation of persons who have an ecumenical passion for this kind of work? And I think that's probably still a challenge for the church, but maybe it is in the area of service, as you suggest, that there's where the focus needs to be in terms of ecumenism.
David, I was going to say, you talk a little bit about the dwelling, because I think that's an interesting example of a practical partnership.
Yeah, it really is. So, we have, I'm maybe mainly given background for Rock here, but, so we've had transitional pastors come to us from the Presbyterian Church, the Lutheran Church. We currently have a United Methodist pastor serving a congregation, happens to be Ruth's congregation. So we've always sort of had some real friendly exchange going on, even before all the agreements. So that's kind of been part of our history. But a couple things happened. A few years ago, a Lutheran church was using one of our facilities in Wilmington, North Carolina, and the pastors became friends. One thing led to another, and eventually they entered into a joint ministry agreement. So we currently have a Moravian pastor serving a Lutheran church and a Moravian church, meeting in a Moravian facility in Wilmington. That's worked out really well, and that's an expression of, hey, we can do stuff together. The most recent thing we've done is a congregation being formed here in Winston-Salem aimed at including and creating church for our homeless neighbors in the area. And so it was an idea that got started with the Lutherans, but they reached out to us probably a year and a half ago and said, would you like to partner? And during this year, we figured out how to move in that direction. So it's a Moravian Lutheran or Lutheran Moravian mission. The pastor is a Lutheran pastor, and poor girl, she has to show up at both denominational meetings and give reports to both denominational offices, and she's doing really well so far. But it's kind of exciting because we're in it together. And when Bishop Tim Smith and I were together, kind of to celebrate and to officially make it happen, he said something that I thought was really striking. He said, we Moravian, or we Lutherans, he said, we're actually thinking about not doing anything new without being in partnership with somebody else. And I thought, man, what a great vision. But it's an example of both. Each denomination brings its gifts and strengths to that ministry, and it becomes way more than it would have been if it was a Moravian thing or a Lutheran thing. And that's where a lot of that's that energizing part that I'm talking about for these things, and it's exciting. It's like we're doing this together.
Very much so. And I don't know who's joined us from Prince of Peace. Is that Brother Dion who has a question?
Yep, that's me. Sorry. I do have a quick question. Hello, everybody. I should say that first. Hi.
No, brother. Good to see you, man.
Hi, Betsy. How are you? Good to see you too. It's been a while. I guess the question I have is, how do we, or perhaps how concerned are we? And please understand, I get the need for ecumenism and all. I've been involved in ecumenism practically all my life. But how concerned are we with keeping our individualism as denominations? Because that's a major concern for me, as I see some of these efforts that we make to partner with other denominations. I see a lot of the traditions bleeding into, or I see cross-contamination taking place. How how concerned are we with, you know, keeping our individualism and still be ecumenical? So that's my question. Because like David said just now, you know, the two Catholic bishops were there and, you know, waving hands and raising hands. That's not intrinsically Catholic, much more for a Catholic bishop. So, you know, how do we keep our individualism? That's the question I have.
So
That's too tough a question. Nobody wants to answer.
Well, I'm going to give you the answer I would have is if losing our individualism is the only way to bring about the reign of God, then so be it. However, I don't think that we're at risk for losing our individualism, because I think we are too mutual. I mean, I don't have the same Lutheran Moravian church, that one church kind of thing that you have in the South, but I'm not worried about losing our identity at all. In fact, I think it helps us claim our identity even more by sort of like stone sharpening stone. Wow, okay, you guys do it that way. That's not how we do it. You know, so that means, you know, or why do we do it that way? That's dumb. Let's do it your way. You know, that kind of a thing. So I think it's a mutual learning, and but I guess I'm not worried about losing our individualism.
Yeah, Betsy, I think I would agree with you that it's not so much for me about individualism as identity. And I don't, and actually what involvement I've had in dialogues are with the Moravian Episcopal Coordinating Committee. I've learned more about the Moravian Church in a way than I ever knew before, because I've been pushed to ask questions that you just articulated. Why do we do it the way we do? And those questions, I mean, it's that dialogue really that pushes me to explore our own identity, and I think in most cases has strengthened that identity.
One thing which I think we really need to remember is, I mean, I think very central to Moravian identity is that we are a world church. The majority of Moravians in the world do not live in Europe or the US. The majority of Moravians are Black and poor, and that is both some part of who we are and part of our gift to our ecumenical relations.
I guess, Dion, I would answer with a couple things. One is, I remember the discussion before we entered into the formal relationship with the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. You know, we had a synod, we were discussing it, we were going to either vote to be in full communion or not. It was a big step. I remember having a conversation with one of my clergy colleagues who was expressing a great deal of reservation and fear about our being absorbed into the Lutheran Church and losing our identity. Because, I mean, proportionally, we're tiny. You know, like the list of denominations goes like this, and then somewhere down below other is where the Moravians are, you know, in terms of size. So, I mean, it was a legitimate fear. But what I said to her at the time, I said, you know, let's not sell ourselves short. You know, we have our own heritage. We have our own history. We have, you know, at that point, 500 plus years of existence through thick and thin and trial and triumph. And we know, you know, we have our own theological traditions. We have our own way of understanding the church. We have our own practices, you know, and so why would you think that just being friends with the Lutherans, we were somehow going to be you know, rolled up into what they were doing? You know, let's not sell ourselves short. You know, we're going to be able to stand up in the middle of that conversation and not be overwhelmed, is really what I told her. And the second thing I'll say is, surprisingly, when I'm out, you know, involved in some of these things, it's often that people, this business of every denomination has their gifts and we're going to learn how to appreciate them. What happens is we're in conversation and someone says, wow, that's how you Moravians see that? That's how you Moravians do that? that's incredible. I wish we did it that way in our, you know, or boy, we sure have a lot to learn from you. And, you know, that trade-off that Wayne is talking about, where we learn about our own identity, but we also appreciate somebody else's, that's been very apparent. I'll give an example from the Lutherans. Years ago, I was the evangelism person here, so I wanted to steal a resource from the Lutherans. So I wrote a letter to Brent Dulsing, who at the time was acting in charge of evangelism, and I said, can we please steal this resource? You know, and promise to give you credit. And he wrote back this really nice note. He said, funny you should ask, because we were just writing our evangelism strategy, which is in the Lutheran Church is this huge thing that takes, you know, took several years and has 5 chapters and, you know, all the supporting documentation. He said, we just were on a retreat working on our evangelism strategy, and we were wondering how it should start. And one of us got the Moravian Daily Textbook, and we were praying with the Moravian Daily Text as our devotions. And after the opening devotion, someone said, you know, why don't we do what the Moravians would do and start this thing with prayer? And sure enough, the first article of their big long statement about evangelism was prayer. And Brent said, basically, you can borrow whatever you want because we've already stolen your emphasis on prayer. So it was, again, it's that exchange. I think our identity is strengthened in the exchange sometimes, you know, so that's what I would say. So, yeah.
Any other thoughts or questions?
Well, I think another point I'll make is, and it's back to practical. This is back when I was in the parish. My little church in Longwood, Florida decided we would put a roof on a habitat house. It was a big mistake because it was way too big a job for us to be able to pull off. And we had the good sense to go down to St. Stephen Lutheran Church, half-mile down the road, and say, do you have any folks that might be able to help us do this? And they showed up, and together we put the roof on the house and helped the family that was in need. That, to me, that is a touchstone experience of what we're talking about when we say ecumenism. You know, and it's doing more together than what we could do separately. And by the way, we had a whole bunch of fun doing it. You know, so.
Absolutely. And I'm not sure we talked specifically about the Presbyterians or the PCUSA, but I know particularly our agency, which supports the ministries of the Southern Province churches, we provide a resource center for the local Presbyterian synod or diocese, whatever you want to call them, but I think they're called a synod. But and so our educator group is ecumenical, and we have a Lutherans and Presbyterians and some Cooperative Baptists, and you know we're fairly ecumenical even in our local sort of work to support ministry. So I just mentioned that, and we participate with the Association of Presbyterian Christian Educators, and our Moravians have been very involved in leadership in that group for many years, and that's been very much of a mutually beneficial relationship as well, for sure. Yeah. All right. Anything else anybody wants to say or ask?
Well, so some ecumenists they've talked about this time that we're going through as an ecumenical winter of sorts. I think Kinnaman has talked about this ecumenical winter, and you know, assuming that everyone's not watching the Supreme Court nomination right now. I had great hopes for, you know, many Moravians being interested in this. So I'd hate to think that this is just for the lone UCC guy. I'm just curious. You know, we've someone had mentioned no youth being around in ecumenical circles. And I know that when I had an opportunity to meet Betsy in Montgomery for our CUIC gathering, you know, I'm 43 and I was one of the younger people there. How do we? I mean, I think that we started to answer that in terms of hands and feet work together. We're better together than we are apart. But how do we revive this this passion for Christian unity among all of our churches? It's a big question, I know.
It's the same question that we asked on the racial justice panel I was just on. Somebody said we're all long in tooth who were on the panel. And I mean, I go back to David's comment, Rock, that, by the way, it is good to see you. I was like, I said to Ruth, how do I know this guy? How do I know this guy? I was like, so thank you for clicking that for me, because I knew I'd met you and I just couldn't place you. I think it's doing the habitat stuff. It's walking on the streets for Black Lives Matter. They're not interested in conciliar mumbo jumbo jots and tittles. They want to get out and change the world, which is what we all wanted to do. We just did it differently back then. By the way, Michael Kinnaman is our only claim to fame in his world is he called us a both-and church in an either-or world. That was back in 2010, maybe, David, when he was still NCC general, whatever, and he spoke at the Northern Province Synod, and that was what he called us. And that's been a moniker, actually, that has been a gift, I think, that we've offered to the ecumenical witness.
Yeah, I think about that that action reflection model, and what I think about with young adults, and I've experienced this especially at the North Carolina Council of Churches. I've been involved with them. I'm not currently on their board, but I served a couple of terms, and if you start with reflection, you're going to lose a lot of people. If you start with action, which leads to reflection, that's the doorway in. And so what we have to figure out is how do we, a high 35-year-old Moravian pastor, I want you to be on the Christian Unity Committee of the North Carolina Council of Churches. Well, what do? Well, they get together 4 times a year and they talk about ecumenism and full communion, and yeah, right. So I really think, I think this business, the reason why I keep hammering on it is because my personal experience has been that when we do stuff together, then it opens that door for theological reflection and further, deepening of things. But to me, that's really where we are these days. I don't know of any of our younger pastors that I can invite to be on the Christian Unity Committee. I can probably get 4 or 5 of them to show up to let's do something.
Well, I'm going to jump in here before I lose you all. So I'm in Phoenix, Arizona, and I knew nothing about the Moravian tradition because there doesn't seem to be any Moravians out here. I grew up in a federated church between the UCC and the United Methodist, and served a United Methodist congregation, a United Methodist appointment as a UCC pastor. And while I was in that appointment, I had a woman show up to my church who identified herself as a Moravian. And so she started bringing me these Moravian magazines, and I would read that faithfully here in Phoenix. But so I knew about the Moravian tradition through her, and then until CUIC, I didn't really have any connection to the Moravian movement on a whole. So are there Moravians, on the west side?
Well, there used to be Moravian churches in Peoria, actually. So if you told me, can you remember the name of the woman? Because probably between Hermann and me, we probably know her. So, Rock, what happened in the sad reality is Moravian church expansion. The churches in Southern California and then in Arizona were Moravian snowbirds who wanted to have a Moravian church out there, but because it was a parachute drop, there was no sort of supporting infrastructure. And for some reason, we are terrible at figuring out how to reach people that have, we just don't know how to do evangelism very well. And so we've closed up the 2 churches in Arizona and all but one of the churches in Southern California. Actually, when the young adult, what is that youth thing, the Unity Youth Tour, was that what it was called, David? That one of the people from Germany said, why are there no Moravians between North Dakota and California? And I said, because you haven't gone there yet to tell people about Jesus Christ. So we're just not good at it.
So we have some things in common.
We're the best kept secret, Rock. So I did my DMin at Luther Seminary in St. Paul. And for the 15 people, there was only one other person that had ever met a real live Moravian. So they would sort of poke me and say, are you a real live Moravian? It's like, you're now my definition of what a Moravian is. And I said, Lord have mercy, But by the end of our 5 years together, the moniker of that group, the little slogan was, everybody needs a Moravian. So we are the leaven in the bread. We're that little seed. And today in my, however many hundred people were watching that thing, I started out with today's daily text, the Moravian daily text for today, because it was fitting. And I decided to draw on our tradition, our history.
I'm part of a little text study group of Lutherans here in the Phoenix metro area, and we start our time together with Moravian daily text. So that tradition made it out here among Lutherans.
In our Moravian Cup of Covenant last month in Minnesota, we had two Methodists and 6 Moravians, I think. Kind of an annual review of our ordination vows.
Yeah. I'm not sure why the silence is more awkward on Zoom.
Right?
I'm just like, well, I want to be sure because it takes time for people. They have to get to the unmute button, and so everything's a little slower and takes a little more time, which is kind of rough for me. It's rough. But I'm learning. So, well, thank you all for being here today. Next week, we're going to be doing a check-in with congregations to see sort of, okay, here we are in month, whatever, I don't know, the 8th month of March. What's happening in your congregations? And we're going to hear from several different congregations. And then on the 27th of October, Brother Riddick Weber is going to talk about Moravians and citizenship. Seems timely. So, so those are the next couple weeks worth of office hours topics. And this will eventually appear in some form on our YouTube channel. So for those, like I said earlier, who don't care about ecumenism today, but may tomorrow, they will have an opportunity to learn something too. So I thank you all very much for being here. And thanks to Dion and Rock and Margaret for joining us. We appreciate that. And to our special guests for talking about what it means to be an ecumenical church. So I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon, and we'll see you next week, hopefully.
Thanks for the invite. Good to see you all.
Bye.
Thank you for putting this together, Ruth. Thank you.
Sure. It was a great idea, Rock. I appreciate it very much.
Great to see you, Rock. Great to see you, Dion.
See you too, Betsy.
Margaret, now you finally show up. Okay, there you have it.
Good to see you, Hermann.
Just listening.
Thank you, Ruth.
See ya.
It's good to see you too, Wayne. Don't let me forget that. Always good to see Wayne.
Always.
Take care. Good to see you, Betsy.